It is important for Canadians to reflect more at the present time about diversification of the economy. It's also about breaking down internal trade barriers.
Great ideas about internal trade, that we're going to knock down those barriers and we're going to expedite that. Good conversations about expediting permitting right across the country, making sure we get shovels in the ground quicker to extract our critical minerals.
If there is or not some tariffs, we need to have diversification of markets.
So we need to have better relations with Europe, with Latin America, and in this particular time with Mexico, where we share some similar challenges. But there are many other trading partners, and we need to diversify. We cannot be so vulnerable to the whims of Donald Trump.
They have lost control of our national sovereignty by blocking pipelines, mines, LNG plants. The Carney-Trudeau Liberals have made us hopelessly dependent on the Americans.
Unlikely allies. The threat of U.S. President Donald Trump's punishing tariffs on Canadian goods is, despite the 30-day reprieve, unifying politicians from all different levels of government and across the aisle into a new push for Canadians and governments to buy domestic, to get rid of long-standing internal trade barriers, and to diversify our energy export markets. So how should we interpret the Trump effect on Canadian political consensus? Is it real, and how long will it last? Our Sunday strategy session is here to talk about just that. Kathleen Monk here in studio is former Director of Communications to the late Jack Layton. James Moore is a former Conservative Cabinet Minister. And Scott Reid is former Communications Director to Prime Minister Paul Martin. Hi, everybody.
Hey there.
Good to see you. This week was almost a bit surreal, James, as someone who's covered a couple of different federal governments at this point, just to hear the way, in particular, everyone was talking around, building new pipelines, things that had been so divisive in the past. What do you make of the moment?
Well, I think it's a good sign. It's a good sign that Canadians, when they're pushed, they push back and they stand up tall. And you see that in small ways and big ways. I went into the grocery store and, I know that it's not quite true, but they were putting French's ketchup in the front. I know that Heinz uses apparently Canadian tomatoes as well, but it was a sign that Canadian voters are voting with their wallets, voting with their feet. And the manager of the grocery store, he said, we're just so tired of people asking us where's the Canadian-only stuff that they decided it's inside the store to start moving their products to the front. So whether it's having a little bit of bounce of patriotism at hockey games and singing the anthem a little strong, buying Canadians, or looking to their politicians and saying, look, I'm a Canadian doing my part in my little way. You do your part in the big way and make this country a little bit stronger, a little bit more effective in protecting the Canadian interest against this threat. Net, I think it's very good for Canada.
What's the secret ingredient, do you think, Scott, to it lasting?
Well, danger, unfortunately, is the secret ingredient. It's the external threat that Trump and his capriciousness represents. And so hopefully we can maintain the spirit of unity and the determination to forge forward on key policy areas, but we don't have to continue to face the irrational threats of Donald Trump. It is interesting, though, to see how much this has completely rewired the political landscape. Pierre Poilievre still in the lead in terms of popular vote, but you can see him struggling to figure out what his new footing should be. All these kind of rhyming couplets, these sort of angry alliterations, attacks, they don't work. He can't go to a microphone and just go, we're gonna thump the Trump. It's not carrying the day. So he's having to move toward that broad consensus. And you can see Canadians are now comparing him not to Justin Trudeau, but to the threat of Trump and to Mark Carney. And that's how a lot of people are beginning to think about issues today, and particularly probably the elections that are going to come tomorrow.
What are your thoughts, Kathleen, on the upending impact of Trump right now?
Yeah, I think that Trump has been a really unifying force, and it's actually turned the country to really do almost like a nation-building moment. We're seeing parts of the country that often have anti-nationalist sentiment now cheering on Canada, right? And so you see, Quebec arguing for strengthening Hydro-Quebec. We see, BC fast-tracking mining projects. Like, it's a real nation-building moment, and I think that is squeezing out, as Scott just said, what does Pierre Poilievre have to say on this. The question is, where do our political leaders go on this? And Pierre has a very difficult challenge, Poilievre has a very difficult challenge in the sense that he has to do two things. He has to now redefine what he stands for, because Trudeau's out, carbon tax is kind of dead. But he also has to differentiate himself from all of the federal, provincial, municipal leaders that are out there already saying all the things that Canada could do. And so that's really, really hard. Since he launched his leadership race 3 years ago or whatever, it's like he's been saying that, Canada's broken, but it looks like Canada's not so broken. It looks like kind of Canada's become Rocky Balboa, is getting up off the mat and is ready for this fight, right? And is really putting forth ideas that could change, in fact, how our nation works. And people are excited about that.
I think, James, as Kathleen and Scott describe it, it also makes me think of the Ontario election, where it's difficult for the opposition right now to punch through, because though he's the leader of the PCs, Doug Ford also is the premier. And when you're in a position of power, like, there's deference to listening to that person in response to the threat that Trump poses. What is your view on whether or not that poses a challenge for the Conservatives? How do you anticipate they'll navigate it?
Yeah, a lot of parts of your question. I mean, I think there's a little bit of a challenge that if in the immediate term, if Doug Ford is going to wear the Captain Canada hat and effectively campaign against Donald Trump, not against the Ontario Liberals or New Democrats, then at least for Ontario voters, you kind of wonder if the itch has been scratched of sort of standing up to Donald Trump through your ballot, and then you kind of shift to, okay, now that that's been done, what do we do in terms of the substance of the policy? So I think you kind of have to anticipate that may be the dynamic for the third of Canadians who live in the province of Ontario. But look, this is still very, very young in terms of what the dynamic will be. Pierre Poilievre versus presumably Mark Carney in terms of the campaign. Mark Carney hasn't done interviews. He hasn't done interviews in French. They haven't had a leaders debate. And you remember the clips that came out of previous leaders debate with Michael Ignatieff and Stéphane Dion both. Those were pretty caustic to their general election campaigns. And the Conservatives have a lot of money and a lot of learned experience about how to campaign and campaign effectively against the Liberals. And I think all of that has yet to be deployed. So we're very, very young in sort of the political cycle here. But yes, Pierre Poilievre, they're certainly, to Kathleen's point, have to shift their narrative from the carbon tax to this broader pan-Canadian narrative of bringing Canadians together, putting Canada first, and doing so in a substantive and credible way. And I think that's his challenge, and I think he's up to the challenge.
Scott, more and more people in and around Mark Carney, and I'm curious to see if you're hearing the same thing, anticipate that the Liberals, if he ultimately becomes the leader, could be the ones to try and trigger an election as soon as possible. What do you think the chances of that are?
Yeah, there's a million angels dancing on the head of a million pins before we get to that kind of, specific.
Well, it's like a month away.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think let's keep it in the here and now. The last number of days, I think Mark Carney, you've seen his campaign sort of shift focus. He's no longer really competing against his liberal leadership, the other liberal leadership candidates. He's almost starting to address the country. And I think he's looked, forceful and formidable on this issue of Trump and the tariffs and what's the ongoing answer. And I think one of the challenges for Pierre Poilievre, and let's not overstate it, the guy's still wildly and widely ahead. But one of the challenges for Poilievre is he's been an outstanding political leader when it comes to pointing out problems. He's angry and angrier, but suddenly it feels like with Trump and tariffs and this economic threat facing us, people are wondering about solutions. And Carney on that front has looked better. I think that's why the polls show him as a more preferred option than Poilievre when it comes to addressing Trump. So I think people think inherently, well, given this guy's background and given his seriousness, we might get answers out of him. Poilievre is going to give us political slogans and talk about the problems, but maybe we have to go to a Carney for answers, and that's an advantage for the Liberals.
I mean, to be fair, there were some policies put forward by Pierre Poilievre this week, but they focused mostly on the border. And Carney did put forth, for example, a set of policy proposals, kind of generally speaking, where the economy is concerned, and lots of them had to do with Trump. He did do that press conference, but he hasn't necessarily being tested in the same way other leaders have. Though I will say both he and Poilievre have not done an interview here.
Yeah, and Poilievre has tried to change his messaging. You heard him come out with the Canada First messaging, and he's rolled out new ads. But I think that this just shows, like, when a country is in a time of crisis, which arguably we are now, an economic crisis, economic warfare, that it's really hard for opposition leaders to punch through, right? It's the federal leadership, it's the government of the day, it's those people who have those solutions that can drive those conversations with our U.S. neighbors that are actually, sucking up all the airtime. And that's, to your point about what's happening in the Ontario election, election. It's really challenging in that environment too, because basically the tariffs and Trump are dominating the news cycle. So how do you get through with another message? It's got to be pretty dramatic and pretty succinct.
Okay, I have to leave it on that note. Thank you all for your succinct and informative comments. Scott Reed, James Moore, and Kathleen Monk, our Sunday strategy session.